History as it happens, November 2nd, 2021. Nixon Shadow.
5 people have been arrested and charged with breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee.
President, obviously, or anybody in the White House, or anybody in authority in any of the committees working for the re-election of the president, have any responsibility?
I neither took part in nor knew about any of the subsequent cover-up activities. I neither authorized nor encouraged subordinates to engage in illegal or improper campaign tactics.
If Watergate is synonymous with scandal, Richard Nixon defines presidential malfeasance as the only man to resign the office in U.S. history. The Watergate story's been told a million times. Its lessons remain: beware the rogue executive, that no man, no office is above the law, that country must come before party, must come before loyalty to any individual. Or have we forgotten? That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
So why Nixon? Well, that's easy. Because Nixon still matters, and historians continue to write about his epic fall from power. As we today grapple with our own political dilemmas, none more urgent than the fate of what is left of our democracy.
Nixon's highs and lows were greater than most of us, but, we all have a good side and a darker side. Anybody should be able to empathize with Nixon.
And that is journalist and historian Michael Dobbs, author of King Richard, Nixon and Watergate, An American Tragedy. Our conversation is coming up in a moment. We can count the tragedies or maladies afflicting the body politic. It's been said the institution of the presidency has never fully recovered from the damage done by Nixon. And beyond the problem of a rogue individual in the Oval Office, there's something else Americans today have to grapple with, and that is one of the lessons of Watergate was the importance of our system of checks and balances, that no one branch should accumulate too much power, especially when it comes to war-making. Remember, one of the articles of impeachment charged Nixon with concealing from Congress the secret bombing of Cambodia, a neutral country during the Vietnam War. The House Judiciary Committee rejected that article, and we should also note the year prior, Congress passed, over Nixon's veto, the War Powers Act that supposedly would rein in White House war-making. Well, I don't think it has worked out that way, has it? Well, anyway, Nixon, Watergate.
In all of the millions of words of testimony, there is not the slightest suggestion that I had any knowledge of the planning for the Watergate break-in. As for the cover-up, my statement has been challenged by only one of the 35 witnesses who appeared.
Is there anything new to learn at this point? My answer is, obviously, yes. There are important parallels between then and now, and some major differences. Whereas Nixon was discredited, Donald Trump, despite having been impeached twice, the second time for inciting a mob to attack another branch of government while he undermined public confidence in the outcome of the election, Donald Trump now rules the Republican Party. But Watergate remains fascinating on its own, and here to discuss it is, as mentioned, the journalist and historian Michael Dobbs, the author of King Richard, Nixon and Watergate, An American Tragedy. Michael Dobbs, we welcome you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me.
So Nixon, why Nixon? I'm curious as to why you, as a historian and writer who has written about an array of subjects such as the Cold War, Madeleine Albright, to name two, what brought you to the subject of Nixon and Watergate, something that's been written about a million different ways? What inspired you here?
Well, as you said, I've written several books about the Cold War, and I've always been interested in presidents facing crises and how they deal with them, and how these crises affect the rest of us. So, an epitome of a presidential crisis is Nixon's handling of Watergate. It was an existential crisis for him that eventually led to him having to resign the presidency. But apart from that, it's an extraordinary historical resources with Nixon. I mean, it's a paradox that this most secretive and private of presidents actually left behind the most complete historical record. And of course, I'm referring in part to his tapes, which enable a historian or an author to follow him around the White House and really allow you to portray his life in intimate detail that is really impossible with any other president, for the simple reason that no other president is ever going to tape himself the way Nixon taped himself.
That's right. Well, Nixon still matters. He cast a long shadow. And as you mentioned, the tapes, he recorded those tapes so he could correct the record, right? He wanted to make sure that if there were any inaccuracies out there, he had a record of what was actually said, and wound up working against him. Is that right?
Yeah, he was very interested in history and, of course, his place in history. And he wanted to write his memoirs. He had a sort of competitive partnership relationship with his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, who he knew was also going to write his memoirs. And Nixon wanted to make sure that he, not Kissinger, would take credit for some of the extraordinary foreign policy achievements of his presidency, particularly the opening to China, détente with Russia, and so on. So I think that was what largely motivated him, after some initial hesitation, to create this recording system.
So your work has been described as a work of synthesis, where you combine your own extensive research with the existing scholarship. But unlike past historical episodes, we're not just dealing with the written word here. As you mentioned, the tapes. I assume you immersed yourself in these tapes. You know, the bits and pieces I've heard over the years, they're not all that dramatic. Even the so-called smoking gun tape. I mean, the audio is muffled. And Nixon and his plumbers, kind of in a matter-of-fact way, talking about doing all these diabolical things.
Right. Well, I think the tapes are kind of blessing and a curse for historians, because they really enable you to follow Nixon around the White House, from the Oval Office to the Lincoln sitting room on the second floor of the White House, his favorite room in the mansion where he used to retire at night, then across the road to the executive office building where he had a hideaway office. But they give you this day by day, hour by hour, and sometimes moment by moment insight into the life of a president. And he's not always dealing with crises. He's dealing with very matter-of-fact incidents that crop up during the day. He's talking to his wife, his children. One moment he's dealing with a great affair of state, and the other moment he's dealing with something very petty and routine. I mean, it's somewhat like, most of us. So that's what gives the tapes their extraordinary intimacy. And it's something difficult for people writing a biography of Nixon to capture, because, they're trying to write about his entire life. And I was interested in the daily details of his presidency and life in the White House.
And the amount of time on the tapes where you hear Nixon and the others discussing Watergate itself is a few minutes compared to the entire catalog, right?
Well, yeah, it gradually comes to consume him, particularly in the weeks that I'm looking at.
But as far as the break-in, right?
Well, the break-in was in June 1972, and he was running for re-election. Yeah, you're right that at that point he thought he could put Watergate behind him. He didn't focus on it particularly. He had other people focusing on it, and that was part of the problem, because he wasn't really on top of it and didn't really start focusing on it until it was really too late, which was, after the whole thing blew up, after his second term began.
I suppose a better way of framing my question would have been, in order to get to the good stuff, you had to wade through a lot of routine or less scandalous talk. What did you learn about Watergate that surprised you?
Well, I don't actually agree with you to get to the good stuff, meaning the Watergate stuff, because I find the daily routine actually very interesting. I mean, I wrote a book about FDR and Yalta. And of course, at Yalta, they discussed the great issues of war and peace, but they also discussed practical things like There were no bathrooms at Yalta, so they were focused on where they would relieve themselves and wash themselves. And it's that combination of the kind of daily routine and the huge affairs of state, and in Nixon's case, the scandals, that kind of interested me. So I think it's all a combination.
So what did you learn that surprised you about Watergate in all of your research?
Well, I think the broad outlines of Watergate are pretty much known, and I can't say that I sort of changed the thinking on Watergate. What to me was interesting was how Nixon as a person handled this crisis and how he handled the unraveling of his presidency and the personal crisis that Watergate represented for him. I mean, here was a man who'd struggled all his life to get to the top. He was born in dirt poor circumstances, and he made it to the top largely through his own efforts. And then he proceeds to throw it away. And that's a very dramatic story. So I wanted to go deeper into this kind of internal crisis rather than just, repeat all the known facts about Watergate.
Is Nixon already unraveling by the time your narrative begins? Is he losing his bearings? A lot of talk about his mental state during this period. I mean, he seemed to always have a paranoid streak and a fear of enemies, real and perceived.
Well, right at the beginning of the book, my book actually opens on the eve of his second inaugural, January the 20th, 1973. And there he's at the top of his game. He thinks he's put Watergate behind him. And he's talking with his so-called hatchet man, Chuck Colson, about how he's going to get even with his enemies and so on and so forth. So there's always this vengeful streak in Nixon. For example, he's talking about how he is going to drive down the share price of the Washington Post, my old newspaper, incidentally, and punish them for their coverage of Watergate. And then within a few weeks, the whole thing begins to unravel. I mean, I wouldn't say that, Nixon was ever completely out of control. There are tapes where he becomes extremely emotional. Then he had people around him, including Haldeman, Kissinger, and so on, who would cushion him. He might say, okay, we'll bomb them. He'd think it through in the morning and wouldn't immediately expect his aides to carry out that order.
When I mentioned to my dear friend, a retired historian from Ithaca College, Paul McBride, that I was going to be speaking to you, he brought up an episode from this time where Nixon visited at night the Lincoln Memorial and engaged in conversations with young activists or just young people who were at the memorial as a sign that Nixon was starting to lose his grip on reality.
Well, that's true. I mean, that's at the height of Watergate. Actually, that's a little earlier in 1972, I think, when at the height of the anti-war demonstrations in Washington, Nixon can't sleep and suddenly he decides to take his butler, Manolo Sanchez, on a tour of the Lincoln Memorial where the protesters are staked out. And then he has this extraordinary conversation with some of the protesters, trying to sort of convince them that he's acting with the best intentions in Vietnam. And it's like a sort of dialogue of the deaf. I mean, you may say that's a sign of Nixon cracking up, or you may say it's a sign of Nixon trying to reach out to his critics. I mean, it's probably both. He was under huge pressure, both then during the anti-war demonstrations and later due to Watergate. I mean, I think, however, that he was a very resilient man, although he contemplated throwing it all in. In his natural instinct, he was a fighter and fought right to the end.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body.
I mean, that's part of this internal psychodrama is one of the things that interested me about Nixon.
Your book ends before the resignation. Why did you choose to end your narrative prior to the final act, so to speak?
Right. Well, partly because everybody knows the end of the story, so I didn't have to tell them that Nixon resigns at the end. And partly there was a kind of narrative act of his rise and his fall, which I think by the time he makes a fatal decision, actually while he's in hospital in Bethesda, Maryland, at the Walter Reed military hospital. He's suffering from pneumonia. One of his aides, Mr. Butterfield, has revealed the existence of the taping system. Nixon has to decide whether to keep the tapes or not. And he decides not to destroy the tapes. He thinks the tapes can still defend him. I mean, obviously, it's a fatal decision. And I think that really seals his presidency, because then the crisis moves into a different phase with the prosecutors and eventually the Supreme Court ruling that he has to release the tapes. But that's a kind of political, legal struggle. This internal drama that has preceded it really, in my view at least, his fate is sealed by the time he decides not to destroy those tapes.
You mentioned Butterfield. He answered a question at the Watergate hearings from Fred Thompson. It was a shock.
Mr. Butterfield, are you aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir.
When were those devices placed in the Oval Office?
John Dean mentioned in an interview that Nixon might have survived, and others have floated this idea that Nixon, if he kept fighting, might have survived even after the smoking gun tapes came out. Do you agree with that?
I think Nixon could have survived, but I think the release of the tapes sealed his fate in the context of the American political situation in 1973, 1974.
His presidency would have been very difficult had he stayed in office from that point.
He could have fought, but his fate was sealed not by the Democrats in Congress. It was sealed by the Republicans, who eventually went to him, led by the party elders, Barry Goldwater in the Senate. They had also lost confidence in him. So you had this bipartisan agreement that Nixon had to go, which I think is one distinguishing feature between Nixon and Trump. Once he had lost the support and the confidence of his own side, then pretty much it became clear that he had no alternative but to be impeached or to resign. And I think he understood that in the summer of 1974. I certainly think that had it not been for the tapes, he would have completed his second term. It was only the release of that evidence that made his resignation inevitable.
And that's troubling because an enormous amount of evidence had already been compiled against him. We often forget how long Watergate took or dragged on. 2 years, really.
Well, absolutely. Well, from 1972, the break-in, till his resignation in 1974, it took 2 years. And during that time, there's a huge investigation, not just the battle over the tapes, but there were committees set up in Congress. I have on my desk the two indexes to both the Senate and the House investigations, each of which go through many, many multi-volumes of evidence. And again, I think that's quite different to the impeachment cases that were made against Donald Trump, which were rushed through in a matter of weeks. That's quite different from the year-long investigation into Nixon.
One of the lessons of Watergate that some took from it, this idea of a unitary executive, that whatever the president does, it's legal, that the office of the presidency is supreme over the other two branches of government.
Well, that's actually Nixon says to David Frost in his post-resignation interview at some point.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal. By definition. Exactly.
And I guess that's the heart of Watergate. Is the president all-powerful, or is his power constrained by other branches of government? You know, the result of Watergate was to demonstrate that the president wasn't all-powerful. The president is also subject to the law. I think the system worked in 1972 to 1974. It showed that even a president is subject to some legal constraints.
Your book came out earlier this year, so you were researching and writing it during the Trump presidency. Now that we've survived another president, Donald Trump, who seemed to believe that he could do whatever he wished to stay in power.
Look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state.
Did the Trump term and the current climate influence the way you approach the subject of Watergate at all?
Well, I tried very much to be a historian rather than a political commentator. So I was interested in what happened to Nixon, how Nixon dealt with this crisis. Of course, as you say, I was researching this and writing it during the age of Trump. So there are obvious parallels and there are also contrasts. I mean, history never repeats itself exactly. I think it was Mark Twain who said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
It rhymes.
And I think Karl Marx said that history repeats itself first as tragedy and then as farce. And I felt a little bit about that with Nixon and Trump. I mean, I think Nixon is a much more serious, substantive figure than Trump was. And of course, there are parallels between the two. But Nixon I see as has the makings of a tragic figure, whereas I don't see that in Donald Trump.
Well, there were some real accomplishments on Nixon's record. Obviously, China is one of those, the U.S.-China relationship in the news. One difference between the two, Nixon tried to keep all of his corruption and nefarious dealings secret. Donald Trump lays it all out in front of us.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing, and stolen by the fake news media. That's what they've done and what they're doing. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved.
Right. I mean, Twitter didn't exist in 1972.
Good for Nixon, right?
Nixon would have been horrified if his private conversations had become public, as they eventually did. By the way, Nixon never contested an election. I mean, he had in 1960 rather, when he ran against John Kennedy. It was a very close election, far closer than our last presidential election. And Nixon certainly had some basis for challenging the results in Illinois and Texas. But he thought that he should abide by the result, even though he questioned it privately. And he didn't publicly contest the results. It did, however, leave a mark on him. And I think is part of the background in explaining Watergate. I mean, he was determined that he would never be outwitted and outmaneuvered and out-dirty tricked by the Democrats again. And that led to what you've called his paranoia, his determination to get even with his political enemies, the lengths to which he was willing to go to gather political intelligence on his opponents.
The break-in was only the tip of the iceberg. There was a lot that Nixon did that often gets obscured, right, when we only think about the break-in.
Well, I think that was, as you say, the tip of the iceberg. And actually, Nixon could probably have survived Watergate itself because there's no evidence that he directly ordered the break-in or even had knowledge of it. But he certainly created the climate in which the break-in occurred and these illegalities occurred. Yes, I think that Bob Haldeman, his chief of staff, had it right when he said Nixon didn't order Watergate, but he certainly caused it.
And tried to cover it up.
Then he was certainly deeply involved in the cover-up, yes.
It wasn't necessary to win re-election against McGovern in 72. He didn't have to do any of those things.
Well, that's true. And of course, he exaggerated the likelihood of the Democrats winning the 72 election. But you have to remember that when those dirty tricks were originally conceived and the plan was originally discussed, McGovern wasn't the likely Democratic Party nominee. There was a far more centrist candidate, Senator Muskie, who would have posed a greater threat to Nixon probably. And it's possible to imagine circumstances in which Muskie could have beaten Nixon. But by the time that Watergate was actually carried out, Muskie was no longer the Democratic Party candidate. It was this anti-war candidate, McGovern, and Nixon had no trouble fending off the challenge from McGovern. So by the time the Watergate was carried out, the reasons for Watergate to gather political intelligence were really no longer valid.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that timeline. It is important. Another important difference between these two scenarios, Nixon and Trump, is that Nixon never was fully rehabilitated in the Republican Party. He did remain a pariah of sorts to the day he died, whereas Trump is now in charge of what's left of the Republican Party, even after the January 6th riot.
Well, that's true. I think Nixon, however, did succeed in rehabilitating himself to a certain extent.
That's fair.
Particularly in the foreign policy field. Actually, when I was in Moscow, Nixon came out there as an acknowledged Soviet expert and was received at the highest level. Of course, he was received in China as well. He wrote a number of books in his post-presidency. And then when he died, his funeral was attended, I think, by 4 living presidents, including President Clinton, who, thinking of his own impeachment problems, of course, memorably said at Nixon's funeral, Nixon had to be judged on his entire life and not just one episode in his life.
Oh, yes, he knew great controversy amid defeat as well as victory. He made mistakes, and they, like his accomplishments, are part of his life and record. But the enduring lesson of Richard Nixon is that he never gave up being part of the action and passion of his times.
So he did get a measure of political rehabilitation or historical rehabilitation. He didn't, of course, control the Republican Party. I mean, that is obviously quite different between Nixon and Trump.
And as one reviewer of your fine book pointed out, Nixon was never, for instance, invited to give a speech at the Republican National Convention again. I think we know that Donald Trump will be speaking, if not accepting the nomination again in 2024. Well, time is flying by. I want to go back to Nixon's mental state and also this idea of Nixon as caricature. The caricature's probably not entirely fair, but maybe not totally unfair either when we're talking about Nixon in the final stages of the Watergate drama. What's your assessment of the way he's depicted?
I mean, I tried to draw a more multifaceted portrait of Nixon. I was very interested, for example, in the way, suddenly he's talking Watergate with Haldeman and Ehrlichman, and he's berating them for some reason or other. And then his daughter, Julie, comes on the line. And, obviously they have a very loving relationship, and his whole tone of voice changes. And from this sort of irascible, harsh taskmaster, he suddenly turns into a loving father. And I think we can all relate to that. So there are many sides of Nixon's character. And I mean, if he's just a caricature, he wouldn't be very interesting at all.
He was an intelligent man who understood the world to some extent.
Absolutely. One of the best read of American presidents. He's really interested in American history. He had a very sophisticated appreciation for foreign affairs, for politics. But then he also had this dark side. I mean, that's the case with many people. Perhaps Nixon took it to greater extremes. I mean, Nixon's highs and lows were greater than most of us, but, we all have our good side and our darker side. Anybody should be able to empathize with Nixon.
The review I mentioned was written by David Greenberg. He said in it that Nixon was a shabby man, in the end, was a shabby man without a moral compass, pinched of heart and cramped in spirit. Do you agree with that?
I think personally that's too harsh. I mean, it's perhaps one side of Nixon. I don't think it's the whole man. I think that's a bit of a caricature, and I've tried to draw what I think is a fuller portrait. I don't agree with that.
As bad as Watergate was, in my own view, as a student of history, I was born in 1975, so I have no living memory of any of these things. As a student of history, I find that Nixon's prosecution of the Vietnam War was worse, because in that situation, people died.
Right.
The secret bombing of Cambodia, which was one of the articles of impeachment.
Undoubtedly, the decisions that Nixon and Kissinger took in Vietnam led to an extension of the war and the deaths of thousands of Americans and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese and Cambodians.
That's right.
So,
the secret bombing of Cambodia was a war crime, in my view. I'm no prosecutor or lawyer, but go ahead.
I mean, I didn't go into the bombing of Cambodia. It sort of happened before the time frame of my book. Again, you can call it a war crime. You can call some of the things that other presidents have done a war crime.
That's true.
I mean, Nixon's idea was that, he had to demonstrate American power before he negotiated some kind of deal with the Vietnamese. I think that was a misjudgment because I don't think it was, as it was ultimately proven, I don't think it was possible to bomb the Vietnamese into submission. In Nixon's defense, you also have to say he didn't start this war. He eventually found a way to wind it up. He probably could have wound it up a lot earlier, but winding up a war, as we've seen with Afghanistan and Iraq, is a lot more difficult than starting the war.
That's right.
In other words, I'm saying that any blame for Vietnam has to be shared with other presidents.
Well, no doubt about that. Cambodia was a neutral country, although the Ho Chi Minh Trail was inside Cambodia and was used by the North Vietnamese to reach the south. Historians have been debating for quite a while whether Nixon and Kissinger knew the Vietnam War was lost right from the moment they won re-election in 1972. And instead of trying to negotiate a shorter end to the war, as you alluded, they sought this decent interval. Or rather, he knew the war was lost in 1968, but did not want to compromise his re-election chances in 72. So he prolonged the war right from the start of his first term, not his second term. Sorry if I bungled that question a bit. I don't know if you have anything else to add there.
Well, I think that Nixon, he wanted to get out of Vietnam, but he wanted to do it on terms that would, as he put it, save America's honor and save his own honor. And then gradually this war that had begun as the war of his predecessors became his own war. I mean, this, has happened with other wars and other presidents. So that's really the tragedy of the situation, is that he got deeper and deeper into this unwinnable war. He was realistic enough to know that it couldn't be won, but he wanted to get out of it on what he thought were honorable terms.
Peace with honor.
We today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia.
And he kept on repeating that. I mean, I think with hindsight, one can say that the Vietnamese winning the war was more important to them than it was to the United States. So Kissinger at one point says, there must be a breaking point for the Vietnamese. If we bomb them sufficiently, they will cave. But that didn't happen. Nixon at times realized that it wouldn't happen. At other times, he thought it might happen. He was conflicted. Eventually, was part of the background to the whole Watergate scandal that would bring him down.
Back to impeachment. Today, whenever a president does anything wrong, that's the first word you hear, impeachment. But during Watergate, that was not the initial thought, right? It took some time for impeachment to be dusted off from the 19th century and floated as a possible remedy for what Nixon was doing.
Right. First of all, there was a committee set up, a select committee of Congress, a bipartisan committee, that fully investigated Watergate. And it was not until many months later that actually this turned into a impeachment inquiry. First of all, internal witnesses had to appear from the Nixon administration, particularly John Dean. So you then had a kind of he said, she said narratives with Nixon saying one thing and his accusers saying something else. And it was not until it was found out that there was a secret taping system that it became possible to resolve that dispute. But as you say, impeachment was fairly late in the day. And actually, he was never impeached.
That's right.
Not by the full Congress.
The Judiciary Committee voted for it.
The Judiciary Committee voted for impeachment, but he resigned before he was impeached.
Republicans today who publicly cross Donald Trump are on the outs of the party. Many, of course, privately do not like him, but they keep those reservations to themselves. During Watergate, the Republicans who turned on Nixon after defending him for so long, how did they fare after that?
They became the establishment in the party. Nixon was discredited from within, as you've mentioned. There was a kind of regeneration of the Republican Party. But I think there was still a kind of underlying current of people who believed that Nixon had somehow been unfairly robbed of the presidency.
So one of my hopes for the Biden administration, and I guess this will make me sound naive, was that he, as a new president and following Trump, would make an effort to rein in executive power. I mean, there's two issues here. There's the power that the executive branch has accumulated over time and the actions of, say, an individual who's in that office. Hoping not to conflate those two here with this question, but did you have any hopes that the Biden administration or that any president in the long aftermath of Watergate might act to rein in the power of his own office? It's my view that presidents simply have too much power relative to the other branches of government, namely Congress.
Right. And there are two sides to that. One is presidents appropriating power for themselves, and secondly, Congress allowing them to do it and abandoning their constitutional responsibilities. And one saw this particularly in the case of going to war. I mean, Congress voted, I think there was only one dissenting vote for giving George W. Bush almost complete war-making powers after 9/11. And that led us into, my view, mistaken wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, particularly Iraq, when Congress pretty much abdicated its responsibilities. And the Constitution says that power to declare war is vested in Congress. There's been a vacuum because Congress hasn't acted and hasn't exerted its constitutional responsibilities. So therefore, presidents have stepped into the vacuum. I mean, is this the fault of presidents or is it the fault of Congress? I don't know.
My final question to you, Michael Dobbs, deals with Nixon's place in history. Rankings of presidents always have him at or near the bottom. Do you believe he should stay there? What is your assessment?
Well, I think it's a mixed record. I mean, obviously, Watergate, the circumstances of his resignation are a huge blot on his presidency. I put Nixon above a number of other presidents. I think he had the makings of being, if not a great president, at least a very substantive president. So I would put him certainly above the bottom. I mean, I can think of others that I would put at the bottom. Go into them on your show, but I don't put Nixon at the bottom.
We had some bad presidents in the 19th century, a lot of one-termers. Well, some of Nixon's accomplishments endure.
If I may say so, we've had some bad ones in the 21st century as well.
I wonder who you're talking about there. But no, some of Nixon's accomplishments endure to this day. The open door to China. I mean, it's impossible to think of the modern world without U.S.-China relations, right? The EPA is another one of his accomplishments that endures to this day, however gutted it might be now.
Well, China's a good example of how something that looks like an accomplishment in one period then becomes, now we're seeing the results of this opening to China, and we're seeing a very aggressive China, and we're seeing a crisis in the US-China relationship. So the opening to China looks a bit different now than it did a few years ago. Okay. Actually, this reminds me of Zhou Enlai, who was asked, I think Kissinger asked Zhou Enlai about the French Revolution. And was it a good thing or a bad thing? And Zhou Enlai said, it's too early to tell. So that same applies to Nixon's opening with China. 50 years have gone by, and we're still dealing with the consequences of the opening to China.
Michael Dobbs, this has been great, and we thank you for your time today. Indeed, with time, our assessment of major events can change. What might have seemed a success at one point may not age well. But what would it take for something to replace Watergate as the epitome of presidential wrongdoing? I suppose we should leave that to historians. On the next episode of History as It Happens, New Deal or No Deal?
It's a framework that will create millions of jobs, grow the economy, invest in our nation and our people.
As President Biden's social welfare agenda teeters, we're going to look back at a crisis that did not go to waste, the Great Depression, with the great historian David M. Kennedy. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.